Hey, what's up, everybody? This is something I've never done before. I guess it's a reaction video, if you will. And I guess I'll give a little bit of a backstory on this and explain what it is that I'm trying to do. So, a few years ago, somebody I know introduced me to Adam Koralik's videos. And I guess Adam got YouTube famous because of giving his opinions on certain Dreamcast games, which is awesome. Anytime somebody could make a living doing something they love, I am all for it. But he also then did a few technical based videos that were, to use the word bad is definitely not the right word to use it. He pretty much made up terms as he went. It was very uncomfortable to watch. And I kind of wanted to confront him about it because myself and a bunch of others who put a lot of work into their tech videos constantly get emails from people who've seen his videos, ranging from argumentative and mean because, Adam's right, you're wrong, why are you saying that, to very sad emails from people that spent a lot of money on his recommendations. So I guess a bit of time went by and I ended up tweeting him publicly, not like a DM or anything, and saying, hey, we're going to be at the same conference, can I interview you? And in the interview, I'm not even close to the best interviewer, but I was very proud of how I handled it. I was polite. I walked him into it, and I kind of laid the carpet out for him to walk down any way that he'd like. And of course, I had to, of course, approach the question of, how do you feel about some of these videos? How do you test your lag? And I really did it in a way where he could have answered a million different ways, from smooth to joking to whatever else. But I really laid it out for him to come out of this as a winner. And he kind of got nervous because he knows he has no clue what he's talking about and freaked out. And that wasn't that big of a deal. But the next day when I posted the interview, he then told people that I ambushed him and he had no idea an interview was coming, even though to this day his tweet is still public confirming the interview. So kind of not a very classy move. That kind of started a bit of a beef, and he continued to put out some pretty bad emails. See, live, everybody. Some pretty bad videos of stuff. And I guess he had reached out to a few people and said he just wants all this to go away. He doesn't want any more problems, and that's respectable. And I always want to try to be happy. I mean, all I ever want to do is smile, drink beer, and talk about nerd stuff. So, I get that 100%. And then today, I got a bunch of texts from people as soon as one of his videos went live. A video talking about two cables that are probably going to be garbage. And one of those companies, Pound, I absolutely have it in for them because they purposely sell stuff marketing as gaming scalers when they're actually using chips designed for TV signals, and it totally ruins the experience. So I wanted to live stream this, but to be honest, I'm terrified on how this is going to come across. I'm not going to hold back in my opinions at all about anything, so I don't want it just to seem like a hit piece. And to be honest, I always have to deal with legions of Adam Koralik fans who are coming after me every time I speak up and correct him. So I don't know if I want to open myself up to that, but I'm going to go through this anyway. And I also want to go through with a positive attitude because maybe Adam's listening. Maybe Adam went through and listened to all of the criticism. Maybe he watched all of the videos I put out on how to test lag, how to view if a signal's being processed correctly. I mean, all the videos I do, I teach people what I'm doing as I'm doing it, so that way you could verify this stuff yourself. It's no big secret, and it's actually quite the opposite. I would love for people to copy all the work that I do. A shout out would be nice, but certainly not necessary. And I'd love for more people to get to the bottom of certain companies that are kind of known for just ripping people off and blatantly not caring. So let's start this thing up. I got beer in hand, and hopefully this will work.
Stadia doesn't take up any space.
Ads, sorry. And once again, I've never seen this before. This is just a full reaction video. We're just going to go through and see what it's like. Cheers.
Fast, powerful, soothing.
Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about these. We've got the Hyperkin Sega Genesis HDMI cable, as well as the Pound Sega Genesis HDMI cable. Full disclosure before we go into the review, this one was donated to me by Video Games New York, specifically for the purposes of review, and this one was donated directly by Pound themselves, again, for the purposes of review. So I'll put a link in the description to both of their websites. You can check them out if you're interested in either of these or anything they do. I appreciate them supplying these. That said, first and foremost, without having even used these yet, I can already tell you these are not how I am ultimately going to use the Sega Genesis. These are not meant for me. They're basically consumer grade versions that are meant for the average Joe who just wants to play the Sega Genesis on a modern television and just kind of have it be easy and convenient. What these both are is plug and play cables for the Sega Genesis that allow you to use it via HDMI on a modern television. Both of them do things that are very right, and both of them do things that are, I'm going to assume, very wrong before we get into it, but we'll get back to that in the final thoughts, and if I'm wrong, I will eat crow on that. But, so here's how it works. The Sega Genesis, when it first came out in 1989, on board had RGB capabilities. Now, RGB, the easiest way to explain this would be that it's red, green, blue, but it's the color system. It's basically the way the console thinks, and it's the way the games should look. Now, in North America, we didn't have access to it, though. We had composite cables. Now, composite cables, the reason we had those is they were standard. That's just the industry standard of the time. They were included in the box. It's what we used. But composite is not RGB. It just takes the signal and goes, okay, I guess I'll do my best, and it just gives a rough approximation of it. And to put that in comparison, RGB would be like a photograph of something, exactly the way it's meant to look, and a composite would be like literally like a composite sketch. It's a drawing of the same idea. Does that make any sense? You following?
Sort of, Adam. So he's not wrong. I would have chose a different analogy. So far, the video is fine, and he's not wrong, but RGB is like a picture, and composite's like a photocopy of a picture 3 photocopies down. So close enough. Close enough. I'll give him that one. The other way I always like to describe it is imagine you're looking through a window, and then you imagine you're looking through the same window with the screen on it as well. So one of them you're just looking through a clean piece of glass, and the other one you're looking through a screen and then a piece of glass. That's kind of the way I always put it. But he's not wrong. He's not wrong.
So both of these cables did the right thing, where they tap into that RGB signal that was there all the way back in 1989. Now, a lot of devices have done this. This is not a new thing. I mean, I've been doing videos on this for years. There's all sorts of scalers and adapters and high-end ones like the FrameMeister and so on and so forth that do that same purpose, that job. These, however, like I said, they're consumer grade. Each of them is I think $30, and they're basically meant to just kind of give you a better picture than you remember and just make it convenient and easy to use. They're kind of like the McDonald's hamburger version of it, whereas something like the FrameMeister is, prime rib. You see what I'm saying? Now that's not a bad thing, because it's ridiculous to think that every person's going to sit down and get a FrameMeister. Sometimes you just want to plug and play. I get that. So that said, I just want to see how these things actually hold up under scrutiny and what their issue is. So they both did something very right where they tap into RGB, and they definitely get points for that. Where they run into a problem, and this is not their fault, is that they both have scalers built in. That's a requirement. So the Sega Genesis, its original resolution is something really funky and really low. It's like 220p, something really strange like that. It's a resolution that's odd, even to the point where the FrameMeister can struggle with it, the OSSC will struggle with it.
All right, see, this is where I start to get annoyed, and this is where my hairs start to stand up on my arm. You don't need to know these things. So I'm not saying that Adam should know these things. He could so far have been completely fine in this video without adding this, but he's confusing technical terms and thereby spreading misinformation. The resolution of the Genesis, there's actually 2 different resolutions, 320 and 256 wide. All of them are 240 pixels tall. And what he's talking about that potentially causes issues is just the sync of classic consoles that doesn't match exactly the refresh rate of today's TVs. So I just wish he wouldn't say this at all. I just wish he would just skip trying to make things up and stick with his opinions. But let's see if he gets better.
Get the job done, but a lot of recording devices, when they try to go straight through, they're not going to work. It uses a funky resolution. Now,
refresh
if for
rate.
some reason they had made a cable that was just, hey, one end is Genesis and the other end is HDMI, and there's nothing in between, your TV would not be able to understand it.
Probably
because,
would. Yeah, it
HDMI
probably would. Most newer TVs. In fact, most newer TVs process 240p over HDMI because it's now part of the HDMI standard. And that LG TV I just reviewed won't do 240p over component, but it will do it over HDMI, and it does actually process it as progressive. It just doesn't do a great job scaling it. So once again, not true.
port generally will not support any resolution below 480p, which means it wouldn't do anything. So at the very least, they had to put a scaler in it so that it will stretch to a resolution your TV will understand.
To his point, though, most TVs over the course of from the beginning of flat screen till now, so not the past 2 years, but if you took all flat screen TVs, the percentage of them that process 240p over HDMI, he's right, you would absolutely need to scale it.
So each one did exactly that. They have a little box in the center, and that is a scaler. Now, that's where they run into a problem, because even though they've taken
think he means
the
a little
RGB
chip in the
signal,
center.
the scaler introduces all sorts of potential issues. I'm not saying they have those issues. I'm saying it introduces potential issues. The scaler has to take that original signal and just stretch it to do something so that the television will understand it. In the case of the Hyperkin cable, it very specifically denotes on the box that it does this at 720p. I assume the pound cable does exactly the same thing.
Same guts.
Because 720p is a very standard resolutions for modern televisions to understand.
They come from the same
Layman's
factory,
terms,
by the
it
way.
just means it has to do some stuff and then it works. But the stuff that it does can introduce additional issues, depending on the quality of the scaler. Now, the quality of the scaler could mean that it creates color issues. It could create brightness issues. It can create, obviously it has to stretch. So depending on how well they did that, it could stretch very well and very clean, or it can do it very poorly. I'm betting it did it poorly only because, again, these are very consumer grade. They're $30 a piece or so, whereas a good one like the FrameMeister is $400. So I'm not saying that's their fault. Their whole goal was to keep the budget down just to make it easy. These are not meant for people who care that much about it. They're meant for people who just want to plug and play and go for it. I am curious ultimately how that will play out. Now, the other issue they would introduce, and to Hyperkin's credit, they actually did fix this one. Because 720p is a widescreen resolution, and the Sega Genesis did not display in widescreen, it displayed in 4:3, the scaler that they produced will stretch the image unnaturally wide. The Hyperkin cable actually has a switch on it that lets you fix that. It can go from 16:9, which is wrong, to 4:3, which is correct.
So that means
To their
that these
credit, they get a
boards
point there. They
probably
did
come
actually-
from the same factory with different firmware and a Hyperkin case on it that taps into that switch. So I might be wrong then. They might not be the exact same guts, but I'd be willing to bet it's the same chip. But let's see.
Fix that. The pound cable did not do that, but to the pound cable's credit, they mention a greater variety of compatibility with different platforms, which is also very interesting. Both of these cables mention very specifically they function with the Sega Genesis Model 1, 2, and 3. Now that's interesting. First of all, that the Genesis 3 would even be mentioned is cool. But the Genesis 1...
This is the Nest Wi-Fi from Google.
Sorry.
This
That's what you
isn't.
get for doing
I mean,
things
look at it.
live
It's
recordings.
practically an accent piece. And
1 and 2 use different pinouts. So in order to have this cable support both of them, you literally have to include an adapter that will make it fit. And both of them did that, which is awesome. Now, the pound cable also actually mentions Mega Drive specifically, and that makes sense because every Genesis cable I've ever had never really had a problem with different versions. I've got Japanese consoles, European consoles, North American consoles, and the same cables always worked. So I imagine that's exactly the same situation, but to Pound's credit, they actually thought to mention it and acknowledge it, that this works on Pound, or works on the Mega Drives, and this one does not mention that. But the other thing that neither of them mentions, and I'm actually quite curious to test, is if it works with other things. Neither of them mention the 32X, which is kind of strange. Not that
Of
the
course
32X
it'll work
was a
with the
great big
32X.
success, but anyone who uses the Genesis a lot and is trying to push it will tell you a 32X, even if you don't care about the 32X library, is a nice little bonus feature to help it get better video quality out of the Sega Genesis because it doesn't suffer from rainbow banding issues, unlike the actual Genesis. So it can, while it's
None of that is true, by the way. What Adam's talking about is if you're using composite video, and you're using, like, let's say a Genesis 1 that has the CXA 1145 chip in it, and you plug a 32X into that, and then instead use the composite video output of the 32X, composite will look better because what's happening is the RGB signal of the Genesis is being sent into the newer CXA 1165, I believe that's the number, but the newer video encoder chip. So it's the same RGB from the Genesis that's getting passed through, but processed through that chip. However, if you're talking about RGB video, it's identical. It's whatever comes out of that Genesis is going to go through the 32X. So that's another myth that's been badly spread. There's a bunch of YouTube videos that say your 32X makes your Genesis look better. With composite, it's true, but not with RGB. So that's dead wrong.
Be a minor difference. The fact that it does it at all is a perk. That, and of course, it would also give you access to the 32X library. The Sega CD library is a given since the video output comes from the Genesis either way, or the 32X if you have that. But I'm also curious what other platforms it might function with. In theory, it should function, both of them should function with the Sega CDX. They use the same pinout as a Genesis.
Not in theory.
And the
of course it will.
as well. I know, I can tell you right here and now that it definitely will not work with a Pioneer Laser Active because that did not have the proprietary port on it. It also will definitely not work with the Sega Wonder Mega, which again did not have that same proprietary port on it. The other one though that they don't mention, and it's legitimately surprising, is the Sega Master System. The Sega Master System used RGB. It used the exact same pinout as a Genesis Model 1. So in theory, these both should function as HDMI cables for a Sega Master System.
Okay, two things. I was a little quick to shoot there. Adam's talking about will it work with consoles that have the multi-out. I just don't think he knows what the word multi-out is. So he's not wrong. I retract that. He's right. Any Genesis console that either doesn't have RGB run to the DIN, which I don't think any of them have that, but maybe there's some laser actives that have some issues. I'm not really sure. But I'm pretty sure laser actives do output RGB on the Genesis port, just not anywhere else, or not laser discs through the Genesis port. And the Master System probably wasn't mentioned because there's a few anomalies where, like if you use the MK2000, the Japanese Master System, it's going to be too dark. So companies probably just wouldn't mention it just so it's one less thing to support. But they'll work on anything that outputs the same RGBS signal as a Genesis, meaning, not to get off topic here, but you know, the weird signal that it puts out, too high of a voltage and all that, it should all work with.
So I'm very curious to try that out and just see how these things ultimately perform. Let's actually go ahead and open it up and take a look at each one. So inside the pound cable, they've got it in a Ziploc bag. Interestingly, when I talked to both, I think Pound is run by a guy named Danny, and Video Games New York, this has to be more confusing, Video Games New York is run by a guy named Dan, so we have Dan and Danny. Dan did not make this cable, but he did tell me that the engineers at Hyperkin were getting a little annoyed that a lot of their stuff is kind of associated with frankly not being that great. So they actually put a lot of effort into this one. So I'm curious. I mean, they somewhat proved themselves by including the aspect ratio adjustment, which, by the way, you can also do on your television, or if you have something like the M Classic, that will take care of it for you. But I seriously give them massive props for including that, because they are addressing a serious issue. And then Pound, on the other hand, they actually emailed me. I talked to Danny specifically, and he was like, yeah, so after the Super Nintendo cable and a lot of the feedback we've gotten on other cables, we really put our A game into this one.
I bet you did, buddy.
So, like I said, to their credit, they had it support multiple platforms. They mentioned a lot of them, and they use the true RGB modes, which they make very clear on the back. So we will see how that plays out. But inside, they include an HDMI cable. They include the primary box part, which has the Genesis Model 2 pinout on it. They include the adapter for Genesis Model 1, and then they include the USB power supply. So the Pound cable specifically does require a power supply. Unfortunately, the Genesis itself does not have USB ports on it, so you'll have to plug this into something external, whether it's a powered-up other console like an Xbox One or whatever. I don't typically recommend using the Nintendo Switch because the voltage on that is slightly different, and that can cause issues. So in general, this is just general advice, don't use your Nintendo Switch to power other things that are not Nintendo Switch related. That's just pro tip.
Pro tip. Anyway, this is a pro tip. It's not a pro, by the way. I don't know if that's true about the Switch voltage. I think he's talking about the USB docks. You could also power this off a TV, though.
Overall, it looks like the same usual type of Pound cable. There's a micro USB port on the side where that goes, and so you have all that stuff. The Hyperkin cable, on the other hand, we'll open it up here. Inside, there's a little like warranty card or whatever, but that doesn't really matter. And then we have the actual bulk of the device here. Inside that, we have also a USB cable for power, and then we have the dongle bit, which Okay, so Hyperkin loses a point here in my opinion. While they have the 4x3, 16x9 little toggle thing there, I like that. They've also hardwired this thing together. I don't like that. I got to give Pound credit there. Having a detachable detachable HDMI cable is better in case anything goes wrong with the cable itself. If you want to replace it with something like the M Classic or the M cable or any of that kind of stuff, other options. You have more options with this, and I like that. But that said, they seem like the typical design.
Okay, so a few things. I laugh every time Adam mentions the M cable because he treats it like it's magic when Marseille's website says right on it it's not magic. Also, if you see right here, this connector, I believe just looking at it in a quick glance, I don't know if that's actually the one for the Genesis. That might be the Neo Geo style pins, but Hyperkin had a reputation for screwing that up. And while it technically works and it technically fits, you're jamming something into a receptacle that's not the same size or shape, so you'll wear that out way faster if it's the wrong one. Without checking it myself, I don't want to comment on it, but I definitely wanted to mention that because that is a true thing.
That you would get out of Hyperkin and Pound stuff. Okay, so I've been using both of these for a while, and it's time for final thoughts. Now, interestingly, upon testing both of them, I realized that both of them, so as I mentioned, they both have a scaler inside of them, right? So when you power them up and connect them to a TV, even if the Genesis isn't on, you get a screen. This is the screen from the Hyperkin cable. It just says no signal, which would be to be expected. There's nothing on. Now, interestingly, I tried exactly the same test with the Pound cable, and this was what came up. It's exactly the same, which leads me to believe that they're using exactly the same scaler in each one of these things. One might have stole it from the other. I don't know.
They didn't steal it. It's the same manufacturer that's always made Pound stuff. And if you want to relicense it, you could have them put whatever splash screen that you want, because I think it was the X Agent cable. It's the same exact thing, but with a different splash screen. So the software can be changed on these.
But that basically means that these things are essentially identical. As far as I could tell, that appears to be true, except for like the little cosmetic features and stuff like that, which I kind of talked about, but we'll do a bit more in a second. But let's talk about the video quality that ultimately results from either one of these things. We'll just look at some footage right now. This is first up, this is the Hyperkin cable just running stock. I chose Mighty Morphin Power Rangers for the Sega Genesis. Very colorful game, but also one of my childhood favorites. In my opinion, the colors are kind of washed out. They're certainly better than like composite cables, obviously, but it's not great, which was kind of to be expected. And then if you want to compare it, of course you do, to the Pound cable, this is the Pound cable running under the exact same situation, just direct feed going. And it's noticeably brighter than the Hyperkin cable is. Like I said, with the Hyperkin cable, it was kind of like the colors weren't quite right. It was perhaps even a little dark. The Pound cable seems to be a bit the opposite. It's like the colors still aren't quite right, but now...
So what's clearly going on here then is factories in China probably ran off between 10 and 100,000 of these circuit boards, because that's really the numbers that you need to... I mean, you have to hit insane numbers in order to get it cheap enough to sell like this. But then the firmware can be changed on each. So developers for each company can really sit down if they wanted to and try their best to tweak the firmware to get the best performance out of it. But that's probably what's happening, is the circuit boards themselves were all made in a factory. They're probably already pre-made sitting there. They probably still have, 50% of their inventory just sitting in a warehouse. So companies like Pound, Hyperkin, Level Hike, X Agent just buy a bunch in bulk and then either slap their own case around it, buy a generic case, or if they're actually doing anything different, you could program the firmware and try to tweak things on it. And I'm not a programmer, and I'm not somebody that's smart enough to write code to make scalers work, but there's certainly the potential that you could make some major changes to it, but they look the same. So let's continue.
Now it's like too bright, and while I think they might be using the same scaler, I think that Pound might have tinkered with it a little bit more just to produce a brighter image.
With Nest
Sorry,
from
sorry,
Google,
sorry.
You can see this little face all day.
By the way, I'm not saying anything bad about Adam putting ads. I like ads too, but
Because brighter is more
just
attractive,
interrupts the
but
live
at the
stuff.
same time, it does look kind of washed out. Now the FrameMeister is noticeably different, but is it like worth the price difference? That's really up to you to decide. You know, I'm not here. I'm not in a position to tell anyone what they should be doing. I can tell you though that the FrameMeister is objectively better. It's just a matter of, is the price important to you, and I'm sure it is to a lot of people. So I also decided, just kind of for the hell of it, let's connect all these things to the M Classic and see what the difference.
Of course he did.
So rolling back around to the pound cable, I'm sorry, the Hyperkin cable. This is the Hyperkin cable running with the M Classic. The effect it has on it is that it, you know, buffs out the edges. It does kind of enhance the colors a little bit, upscales the resolution and all that kind of stuff.
Funny,
But
it does look better.
nothing amazing, nothing, you know, night and day or anything like that. It is different, but that's to be expected. And then I do the exact same thing over here when I took the pound cable. Now the pound cable running with the M Classic, and as to be expected, it is, you know, more buffed out and it looks a little cleaner. Colors are improved a bit, but it's still, you know, got that brightness thing. And again, this is basically the same on on the television as it is with the Hyperkin cable. The issue is, to some extent, the recording device. Don't forget, when you're looking at this stuff, you are looking at captured footage that has had to be compressed and edited and re-uploaded to YouTube, and that
100% true.
But in general, it seems like the pound version is just a tad brighter. So when you fire up the FrameMeister and then do that, that's when you see more of a difference between the two. This is, you know, some people like the way the FrameMeister looks on its own. Other people like it with the M Classic. You know, it depends on the console, honestly. I like the color effects that the M Classic gives to the FrameMeister version, but not necessarily the buffing at all times. But that doesn't really matter because we're not really here to talk about that. We're here to talk about these two cables. So I hope that gives you a good sense of it. So if you're thinking like, what is the difference between the two? Like, which one is better? The thing is, I noticed a couple of odd things. First, I want to give Pound credit here because I kind of chastised them for this earlier in the video and then realized I was wrong. So the Hyperkin cable has that switch on it, right? That goes from 4x3 to 16:9, whereas the Pound cable doesn't. So my assumption was that, okay, great, they're going to make me fix it on the TV like they did with the PlayStation 2. Other way around. They've actually got this thing hard-coded to always be in the 4x3 mode. They don't give you the choice of 16:9. So this thing actually pre-adjusts the aspect ratio and corrects the problem for you. So I actually like that. I think that that was a good move. Now, you can kind of look at that one of two ways. You can look at it as Hyperkin gave you more choices, or you can look at it as Hyperkin gave the potential to do it wrong, whereas Pound...
I used to think that as well. I used to actually 100% agree with Adam about, you know, giving the choice to do it wrong, until I believe it was John Linneman that did a video on something that showed that depending on many circumstances, but if you have a scaler and you just set it to fill the screen and use your TV to squish it to 4x3, sometimes depending on the scaler, you get less shimmering and a more accurate CRT-like aspect ratio by letting the cable go fill your TV and then using your TV to squish it. So I'm definitely not faulting Adam for that one because I thought the same thing myself, and I would have never thought of it the other way if it wasn't for John. I just felt like adding that in there.
At least didn't have that problem, so you can look at it either way. But I like that about the Pound cable. The other thing I prefer about the Pound cable, and I mentioned it before, is that it's not hardwired, it's in detached pieces. This is useful, again, because if you want to swap out your own cable, you can do that. It reduces the probability of it breaking because, again, if the HDMI cord part of this cable breaks, the whole thing is junk. Whereas
Agreed.
With that, you can at least swap it out. It also, personally, made recording footage much easier for me because of, you know, the fact that you're not hardwired to this thing. You can swap out any set. You can also add things like the M Classic or the M cable relatively easily, whereas with this, you either need a female to female HDMI coupler or you need an HDMI switch, and you have to go through that whole process. So between the two, I would say the Pound cable is the better of the two for basically exactly the same price and basically the exact same content. You know, that's not really surprising, I suppose. The other thing that was interesting about both of them, I mentioned before that I wanted to try it with all these devices, not just the ones they list. They all work with every version of the Genesis as stated. They work with every version of the Mega Drive as stated. They do work with the Sega CDX. They do work with the JVC XI. And they do work with the Sega Master System. I can get why they put the compatibility thing here, right? And I can get why they didn't list like the obscure things like the JVC XI. But the Sega Master System is an entirely different console. It's just kind of odd that they didn't put that on the box because it actually looked pretty good. Again, not FrameMeister good, but good. So it seems like a weird oversight. But then again, these are targeted towards a North American demographic, and the North American demographic rarely cares about Master System. But I mean, we're talking about just a little
Sadly
bit of white text
true.
on the box, and you're good to go. So if you're in the European market and you're like, hey, I want to use my Master System, you could do worse than these. When it comes to like latency and lag, I was playing fighting games. I didn't really have any problems with that. I'm sure some people will argue that that exists, and it wouldn't surprise me. I can't imagine the scaler in these things is, I mean, we know is not the best, but at least from the basic gameplay that I was doing, I really didn't encounter any issues like that. So there you go. If you're interested in either one of these, I'll put the links in the description again to Pound and to Hyperkin, specifically Video Games New York, if you want to order either of them. Thank you guys very much for watching. If you could like, comment, subscribe, check out all the social media stuff, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all that. I appreciate it. Patreon's in there as well. Thank you very much. Again, thank you to Video Games New York. Thank you to Pound. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all later.
So I'm shocked. That actually wasn't terrible at all. I'm genuinely surprised, pleasantly surprised. I pointed out, some of the stuff I pointed out was nitpicky. The M cable digs might have even just been mean on my part, but that's my honest thoughts on this. I guess that's what a reaction video is supposed to be like. But the only two things that he missed, doing a lag test. In his credit, he did not say this is zero lag. He said the lag didn't bother him, which is fine. But I think I've put out enough videos teaching people how to test lag that somebody who does videos on retro gaming for a living would have invested the very cheap amount of money it would have taken to get that. So I'm pretty disappointed that he didn't go down that road. And heck, I might even reach out and offer to just give him a lag test kit, because if it's going to mean I have to deal with less emails and less of his haters trying to come at me, then fine. And he doesn't, for the record. I think I've said that a few times. Adam doesn't come at me, just some of his overzealous fan base does. So that was kind of annoying, but a channel that's based upon somebody talking about their opinions, I guess they don't have to do things like lag tests. Then again, maybe you shouldn't be branching out to talking about tech. But the one thing that does bug me is he has to have a ROM card at this point. If not, people would send him one. All it would have taken is for him to launch the 240p test suite and then do the drop shadow test. And that's it. You don't need test equipment. You don't need to take video of it. Heck, he doesn't even need to show it. He could just say, I did the drop shadow test and it didn't flicker, which means it's processing 240p as 480i. Heck, he doesn't even need to say all those terms. He just has to say, I fired up the test suite and it's not processing the video correctly, so you might get some flicker. And that's the thing that's the most, I was going to say underrated, but whatever's the word, once again, I'm doing this live all in one take. So whatever's the word that you would use to describe something that people should be enraged about but aren't. If you just review one of these, if you play through a couple of games, a couple of modes of something, a few rounds of Mortal Kombat, you record some attract mode screens, the 480i or the 240p being processed as 480i isn't going to be the worst, but if you actually sit down and play a game, that flicker will start to get to you after a while, at least most people. And it's strange for me to say that because I'm the person that can play a Virtual Boy and never get dizzy or never get a headache. So it's the opposite for me. If I play one of these badly made, mostly Pound and Hyperkin style things, I do absolutely get a headache. Like I can't sit and play Super Metroid, for example. So I wish you would at least do that, because that simply involves pressing play, on your controller and firing something up. But I'm definitely impressed, and he's obviously trying to get better. It's my asshole opinion that you've grown a giant following talking about things that you love where there is no right answer. You're talking about your opinion, how you feel about it. So why not stick with that? Why embarrass yourself and try to branch out? Is it just to get free cables? Because, the testing that I did, like the Rad 2X video I did, was something like 90 hours worth of work total. And this, 18-minute video was probably, even if he was having a bad day and had to do a bunch of takes like I often do, and like I probably should have done with this video, it still must have only taken him a couple hours total, maybe half a day, including start to finish all the testing. So, I don't know. Maybe that's it. Maybe they're just looking for free stuff. I don't understand. But at least he's not as bad as it was. Because if you go back and watch the original video that he did on the scaler, you know, people keep bringing this up. He did that video before the OSSE was released, before there were modern alternatives. I completely forgive him for a lot of the stuff, but he made up words as he went, and that video is to this day still live and still has the same title. And he changed the description, but no one reads the description, especially if you're on a TV. You can't. You just have to read the title. So, you know, props to Adam for at least putting some effort into it, but I would like to see just the smallest, little tiniest bit of efforts in there. And heck, I mean, I'm a nerd first and asshole second. So if he had just messaged me like, hey, dude, I got these cables. Do you know if they have any lag? Can you send me some footage? I would have in a heartbeat. I don't care. I don't care about beef. I don't care about attitude. When it comes down to strict nerds and facts, of course I would help. I always have. Anybody that's ever asked nicely. I think I've said no to a few people before that were kind of rude about it, but yeah, I don't know. So I expected this to be, now I kind of wish I did it live, like a live stream type of thing, just because it's more positive than negative, to be honest. But oh well, I'll upload this. I don't even know if I'm going to make it public. I might just share it with subscribers just for fun or anything. But, you know, this really was one take live. I had not seen the video before. I had seen the screenshots of it people sent me. It's pre-recorded, but all in one take, all live. So hopefully, and I'm just remembering too, I think I forgot to resync my mic, so that's probably all off. Sorry about that, but I don't know. Hopefully you enjoyed this. If not, I'll never do it again, and I'm sorry. See you all next time.